Wow, live stream. Talaga naman.
O yan, Jean, live stream. Kaya ano.
Ano na, this will be the norm na. Ganito na talaga. Kahit na face-to-face, no? Pwede na rin i-live stream, no?
Yeah.
Morning.
Meron na ako picture.
Sa office pala si Herman.
Oo, I'm here.
You're signing. Dadalhin yan dito mamaya. Nakalipat na pala si Lance, no?
Oo.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Bukas na tayo. So, I think, Elise, baka kailangan mo na i-mute ang mga tao.
Okay po, so everyone's muted, but you can unmute yourselves.
Elise, pwede na, no?
Mm-mm.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Magandang umaga sa inyong lahat and welcome to the Tenure lecture of Assistant Professor Enrico Gloria. Thank you for being here and joining us in this very special presentation. But before we hear from Assistant Professor Enrico Gloria, I'd like to call our chair, Professor Herman Kraft, to walk us through the purpose of this tenure lecture. Professor Kraft?
Okay. Thank you very much, Jean. And for those who are here, no, thank you for joining us in this tenure lecture of Assistant Professor Enrico V. Gloria. The tenure lecture has always been a part of the process whereby the Department of Political Science considers candidates for permanent appointments in the faculty. However, it is more than just a ceremony, no? a rite of passage for these candidates. No? It is in fact a showcase, an opportunity for the candidate to exhibit his or her worthiness, no, of joining the ranks of the faculty through or by displaying their scholarship, no, and their capacity to actually articulate, no, the findings of that scholarship. So in other words, no, it is actually an important way by which we can um, have a sense, no, of the capabilities of someone who is actually seeking to join the department, no, in particular, but the faculty of the university in general. Now, more than just more than just than this just being part of, no, a ceremony as far as the tenure process is concerned, and I can assure you it's not just ceremonial, no. It's still, there is still a vote that has to be taken as far as the tenure process is actually concerned. But at the same time, a tenure lecture is actually very much a public testament to the Department of Political Science commitment to considering candidates for admission into the ranks of its faculty who will continue the traditions of honor and excellence, particularly in teaching, research, and extension that the University of the Philippines actually claims. Now, in this context, no, this is a very important part of the process whereby we try to make sure, no, that the kind of teaching and the kind of research that we are actually able to conduct within the department, no, is up to par, no, with what it is that we claim, no, as the National University of the Philippines. Okay, so in that context, no, I'd like to thank everybody who's here for participating in that process and for being part of that public testament, no, and affirmation of what it is that we claim, no, that we are actually doing here. No. So again, thank you very much to everyone who's here.
Thank you, Professor Kraft. And now to introduce our lecturer, I'd like to present to you, I'd like to call Associate Dean for Academic Affairs of the College of Social Sciences and Philosophy, Dr. Ruth Lusterio Rico.
Thank you, Jean, and good morning to all. Of course, I'm also part of the faculty. It is my pleasure to introduce to you this morning our candidate for tenure, Enrico V. Gloria, Assistant Professor of Political Science. As already mentioned earlier, a public lecture is one of the requirements of our department before a member of our faculty is recommended for tenure. This is also an opportunity for our candidate for tenure to display his teaching skills as he lectures on a topic based on his research interest. Assistant Professor Gloria, or Nico to us, earned his Bachelor of Science in Economics degree from the University of the Philippines, Diliman in 2013. Although not a political science major, he took most, if not all, of the core courses in political science for his free electives in the Econ program. After graduation, he took a Chinese language program at the College of International Education and Exchange, Tianjin Normal University, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Tianjin, China in 2015 to 2016 in preparation for his graduate studies. Assistant Professor Gloria earned his Master of Laws in Politics with distinction from the Department of International Relations, Tsinghua University, Beijing, China. He wrote his master's thesis titled The Reluctant Power, a Social Identity Analysis of China's Contemporary Sanctions Attitude, which was awarded Best Thesis. Our tenure candidate joined the department in January 2019 and is currently teaching a variety of courses, namely Pol-Sci 130 Comparative Politics, Pol-Sci 180 Introduction to International Relations, Pol-Sci 188 International Political Economy Theories and Issues, and Soc-Sci 2 Social Economic and Political Thought. Aside from teaching, he has rendered dedicated service to the department through his active involvement in the writing of syllabi for Area 4 International Relations courses in outcomes-based compliant format. Assistant Professor Gloria is also actively involved in various committees, both at the department and the college levels. He is head of the department's Information Technology Committee, a member of the SAR team, Self-Assessment Report team, UP Sahalalan 2022 team, and serves as the department faculty focal person for gathering data for our productivity-based bonus 2021. In terms of research, Assistant Professor Gloria worked as a research assistant at the Third World Studies Center, an economic research associate at the Asian Institute of Management Policy Center, and a part-time researcher at the Strategia Development Research Institute prior to joining the department. He was also research fellow at the Strategic Studies Program of the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies, or CIDS. Among the significant publications of Assistant Professor Gloria are the following journal articles, which are all published in 2021. Justifying Economic Coercion, the Discourse of Victimhood in China's Unilateral Sanctions Policy, published in the Pacific Review. Silk Road Spirit, China's BRI Discourse and its Pursuit for Great Power Status, published in Asian Politics and Policy. Of Benevolence and Unity, Unpacking China's Foreign Policy Discourses Toward Southeast Asia, published in the Journal of ASEAN Studies. And the Philippines in 2020 Exposed Deficiencies and Aggravated Backsliding in a Year of Crisis, published in the Philippine Political Science Journal. Assistant Professor Gloria's research interests, as clearly reflected in his recent publications, are Chinese foreign policy, discourse analysis, Sino-Southeast Asia relations, Sino-Philippine relations, and Philippine foreign policy. So without further ado, with much joy and honor, I give you Assistant Professor Enrico V. Gloria. Nico, you have the virtual floor.
Thank you po, Ma'am Ruth. And thank you to everyone. So first, allow me to share to you my presentation slides for this morning. All right. So I hope you are able to see now my slides. So I will be beginning my presentation now. Good morning, everyone, and thank you again for coming to my tenure lecture today. Thank you in particular to my colleagues in the department and outside my unit for sparing this time of your schedule this week to listen to me elaborate on my research, and to my students as well for the flexibility on your end to accommodate this extra activity on top of our busy schedule. And to everyone tuning in on our live stream, thank you and welcome. Just a very brief introduction and background on this research. This paper titled Justifying Economic Coercion actually represents a major chunk of the master's thesis I have written in Tsinghua back in 2018. So again, thank you to everyone for coming, and it is my pleasure to you to present my research for this morning. So as for the outline of the presentation, it will follow the natural flow of how I wrote the paper, starting with the introduction, elaborating on some research questions, the theoretical framework and the methodology I've used, and then moving to a discussion of findings. Right. So the main rationale for this paper stems from an interest on my end to dig deeper on China's attitudes towards the use of unilateral economic sanctions. And with respect to this, China actually maintains a firm rhetorical opposition to the practice of using unilateral sanctions. Apart from its criticisms against the usual wielder of this type of statecraft, most notably its Western peers, China has consistently emphasized its stern position against unilateral sanctions in many instances. But its commitment to this position becomes a curiosity, I argue, when juxtaposed with more current observations that China has indeed employed unilateral sanctions against other countries. Well, we have the case of the Philippines in 2012, for instance, during the Scarborough Shoal standoff, when our banana exports was basically restricted to enter China. And you have the case of South Korea in 2016, when South Korea, together with the US, decided to approve the deployment of the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, or THAAD, in South Korea. And more cases, as I will elaborate later on. China seems to have maintained questionable logic surrounding its attitude towards sanctions. It criticizes the practice but continues to use them against others. And when confronted with the question of owning up to these measures, China has continuously denied, or at the very least, vaguely acknowledged its use, as observed in 6 specific cases. And briefly, these are the 6 cases that I will be focusing on. I focused on cases of China's sanctions use beyond 2009, which is a period that marks a considerable shift towards assertiveness in Chinese foreign policy, as often argued in the literature. And so we have the case of Norway in 2010 when it approved the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo. Japan in 2010 and 2012 related to its conflict with China in the East China Sea. And Philippines in 2012, as I have elaborated, South Korea in 2016, and Mongolia in 2016 to first quarter of 2017 when it approved the visit of the Dalai Lama in the capital. Again, for these cases, China either outright denies its use of sanctions or vaguely refers to their existence. So for instance, vague acknowledgement refers to China simply threatening countermeasures without specifically elaborating on the shape and form of these measures. Denial, on the other hand, entails a more outright dismissal of accusations or questions that pin down the sanctions behavior to China. The lack of official acknowledgement is the main focus of this research. And part of trying to make sense of how China thinks about its foreign policy, it becomes a point of curiosity for me to inquire how China seeks to systematically justify its use of coercion in light of its legendary opposition against the practice. For this research, I unpack the discourses behind China's vague acknowledgement and denial of its sanctions use. Now, given the tacit manner by which China employs its sanctions, it could be that there are more cases beyond these 6. But these selected disputes, nevertheless, were intentionally chosen to reflect most cited examples of China's growing assertive behavior. Now, just for the definition of how I sort of conceptualized unilateral economic sanctions, I refer to unilateral sanctions as government's disruption of normal economic relations with another state to achieve one of the following objectives: to influence policies of the target state at the political realm, to act as deterrence, to punish recalcitrant states, or to provide necessary symbolisms to a particular audience. This particular definitions becomes more exciting, if you will, if we note the definition that it tries to exclude. So it excludes trade disputes or so-called trade wars between countries because the economic measures in these cases are usually wielded to influence economic policies. Multilateral sanctions are also not part of this research as they are employed by international organizations or a group of states. So throughout my lecture, simply for the purposes of clarity and brevity, I will be referring to unilateral economic sanctions as being synonymous with economic coercion or sanctions by itself. All right. Now, to provide a brief context on how sanctions have been typically studied in international relations, unilateral sanctions are often appreciated from the perspective of the so-called sanctions debate, arguing whether this policy is actually effective in achieving objectives or not. And more recently, studying its overall negative impact on both target and sender countries has also been a preoccupation in the literature. This main focus on effectiveness and impact implies not just the prevalence of this coercive practice among major powers, it also automatically assumes that unilateral sanctions are a valid and an acceptable form of statecraft to begin with, that countries typically and openly rely on. But moving beyond this preoccupation, this paper seeks to contribute to the literature by highlighting the importance of contemporary attitudes towards the practice of using sanctions. Attitudes are often taken for granted since major powers have historically and consistently considered sanctions as a legit policy option. But as we have seen in China's case, this is not as straightforward. And for similar studies which problematizes China's unique approach to the statecraft, they mostly understand China's consistent obfuscation as either part of a calculated decision to ensure quote-unquote plausible deniability. So that means to dodge legal obligations with the WTO, or to maintain flexibility for its leaders when to de-escalate or to simply signal to other countries what China wants to happen without significantly harming bilateral relations. Then there's the minority group of explanations which interprets China's behavior as a result of its memory or historical experience being a target of Western sanctions. While it is certainly valid to appreciate sanctions policy from a very strategic perspective of deceiving the enemy, such case specific explanations have yet to provide a comprehensive take, I argue, on overall sanctions attitude. Yes, plausible deniability explains why China denies sanctions use in case X, Y, or Z, but they do not explain why China has consistently upheld this position or strategy to begin with. And in this paper's attempt to contribute to a more comprehensive understanding of China's sanctions attitude, I take the crucial assumption that normative interpretations of a state identity and its past are also important factors that need to be considered when we try to make sense of China's foreign policy. Now, having laid out the relevant context and the crucial assumptions of this paper, I have here the specific research question that I seek to answer for my research. Now, the paper asks, what kind of discourse has China consistently adopted in disputes where it used unilateral sanctions? And why has China consistently stuck with this type of discourse? So by being able to answer this, it is the hope that we can provide insights on how China's reluctant sanctions attitude fit into China's overall foreign policy logic. And to introduce the framework, the research is guided by the theoretical assumption that China constructs itself as a victim when it finds itself in disputes. And to elaborate more on these points, I have here some of the assumptions made in adopting this framework. First, victimhood or a victim status is, or a victim identity, as I also refer in this paper, is a construction of one's place in society. Hence, at the heart of this definition is identity being constructed by oneself. Furthermore, victimhood as an identity, as a constructed identity, is a stable and meaningful personality's tendency heavily reliant on self-perceptions, especially for those who have experienced considerable trauma or pain in their past. Given that assuming a victim status relies on one's self-perception and construction of such an image, we may be asking, how does one assume and argue for the legitimacy of her victim status in the first place? Well, the literature points to these qualities. First, different from its counterpart, which is the offender, a victim should have passive agency or position over an incident, meaning it should argue that it is simply being reactive or have not initiated the harm leading to the conflict. Second, a victim must assert its innocence and lack of responsibility for the dispute. She must be able to paint a scenario where its justified entitlements or rights are the ones that have been violated. And last, victims must also aspire for positive social recognition, seeking empathy and moral support for the suffering and pain that they have experienced. These are some of the common characteristics that would sort of guarantee a legitimate victim status for an individual. Having laid down these characteristics, there are important takeaways or implications that we must also take note of. First, it goes to show that constructing oneself as a victim is a zero-sum pursuit, meaning you cannot emphasize or make known your coercive tendencies or offender qualities while also highlighting how you are a victim of a certain dispute. A victim simply cannot be the same as the offender. And obviously, this has direct resonance with how China has behaved in its sanctions use, as we will see later on. And second, a victim must also be powerful enough to make its case known and thus successfully claim the status of a victim. So the power to articulate one's victim status also play a crucial role in this. Okay, but you may be asking also, what gains can one get from assuming such a pitiful description of the self? Well, in the study of competitive victimhood in social psychology, this status may be pursued strategically to achieve a host of goals. First, assuming a victim position may establish one's innocence, or to be more precise about it, this allows the victim to escape blame, highlighting the agency and responsibility of the other. A second objective is to justify revenge or its coercive tendencies. And a victimhood position helps achieve this because the self is portrayed as having suffered more than the other. Hence, in a situation of a competitive or mutual suffering, revenge through coercive means becomes more acceptable and just. And last, a victim position garners positive social recognition. Victims are able to locate themselves in a moral high ground, recruiting much needed sympathy and support. And as we will see in the discussion of findings later on, these three are what exactly China's official discourse is able to manifest. Given China's strict and religious opposition to the practice of using sanctions, its victimhood discourse allows it to withhold responsibility from the dispute, indirectly justify coercive tendencies without having to officially acknowledge them, and ultimately maintain a positive image for itself. Now, to uncover manifestations of the discourse of victimhood, I have conducted a discourse analysis of official text as released by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China, or MOFA as I will refer to in this presentation, on the six disputes. But first, discourse as defined in this paper is an accepted way of linguistically attaching meaning either through speech or text to a particular social practice. More importantly, discourse as further understood here is consistent with the approach of CDA, or critical discourse analysis, where discourses are also recognized as windows to discovering power structures and how these are maintained. Critical discourse analysis, furthermore, informs my analysis in three crucial ways. First, as briefly mentioned, it provides us a window to power structures. Second, as Toon Van Dyke has elaborated on the power dimensions of discourse, I also recognize that mental or memory structures of one's place in society allow for the maintenance of these dominant discourses. And lastly, in terms of how to do the discourse analysis itself, CDA suggests looking into discursive strategies or ways of using language to uncover how dominant discourses are systematically promoted. And this is where predicate analysis comes in. Predicate analysis as a way to uncover the discursive strategy of predication simply looks at the descriptors and predicates that China has attached to itself and its relevant others. These predicates are then treated and understood as linguistic manifestations of how China has constructed certain identities, namely victim and offender identity, for the relevant parties concerned. Overall, 279 official documents from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs were collected and analyzed. These were all accessed online through their website, and all are published in official English translations. The focus on English translations instead of the Chinese version is a conscious decision on my end, and it's also aligned with the objective to understand how China wants itself to be perceived or seen by its international peers. Such, after all, is the nature of public diplomacy. These MOFA documents are mostly transcripts of press conferences, which comprises about 96% of the total number. The rest are either official statements or press releases published by the ministry. Now, as for the document sampling, and this is going to be brief, and its distribution per dispute, the idea was to collect all available documents within a dispute's time range. So for example, within the 3-month duration of the Scarborough Shoal standoff, I was able to collect a total of 29 documents that explicitly discusses the dispute. And within that 29 documents, I was able to extract 96 predicates for China, the self, and 154 for the Philippines, the other. And as you will see here, the population is mostly populated by Japan's case in 2012 and least populated by Mongolia's case in 2016. There are a lot of reasons why there's a wide gap in terms of the frequency, and most significant of which is how China actually allotted airtime, if you will, for the disputes in question. Now, moving to how I did the discourse analysis, the method is pretty straightforward. First, I focused on carefully reading all the 279 documents with the intention of extracting the predicates or descriptors found in each document for each of the two relevant subjects, so China and the other. Next, these predicates were analyzed, grouping and categorizing together predicates with similarities in meaning, as I have interpreted and abstracted. This process yielded several groups of predicates for China and several groups of predicates for the 6 others. The next process was to pair those that are related with each other. Pairing them is consistent with Jennifer Milliken's idea on what predicate analysis is used for, which is also to uncover relational distinctions as represented by the predicates. So for example, it is natural to find in text that when China describes itself as being innocent or peaceful, there's a corresponding predication for the adversary that describe it as otherwise. So I pair those two groups of predicates. So from a group of distinct predications, you now have a pairing of particular distinctions that describe how the two subjects are often perceived in relation to each other. And as I have mentioned in my analysis, this was informed by victimhood as theory in trying to interpret what China is saying or what descriptions it is employing. The predicate analysis ends with a core opposition that essentially portrays China as the victim and the 6 others as the offenders. And making up this core opposition are more particular oppositions that describe how the victim-offender relationship has been specifically portrayed. And this will be the subject of my next slides. As I have shown in the previous slide, we have here a core opposition between victim and offender, serving as the underlying frame and also summarizing the particular oppositions that make up China's victimhood discourse. Now on to the particular oppositions. The particular oppositions represent descriptors that assign certain identities or expectations for the self and the others. First, we have positionalities, or the particular opposition that describes China and the others' dominance or agency with respect to the dispute. It pertains to whether China or the other is a passive or an active actor with respect to the conflict. As I have shown in the previous slide, making up this core opposition are predicates that ultimately describe China as the innocent victim and the other as the wrongful offender. Now, moving to the second pair, we also have a particular opposition that describes China and the other's intentions or deeper motivations concerning the dispute. This would refer to painting the other as the malevolent or malicious party, harboring intentions that ultimately harm China's interests for the sake of the other's gain. China, on the other hand, would portray itself as the benevolent party, as it prioritizes peaceful means such as dialogue and negotiation, even though it was at the receiving end of the other's wrongdoing and ill intentions. Again, this is China's portrayal of itself. It doesn't need to be necessarily true on the ground. And lastly, we have the third pair, which is a particular opposition that ascribes what relevant parties must do to resolve the conflict. I collectively refer to them as resolutions. The descriptors under this category mainly instruct the other to focus on corrective actions, which effectively makes them the guilty party in China's eyes. The self, on the other hand, is instructed to exercise resolve and defend its interest, thereby portraying itself and its responses as being justified. As you can see here, the next 3 slides will focus on discussing how particular oppositions and their abstracted descriptions are manifested in the analyzed texts. I will focus on the frequency and the count and how they were manifested specifically in the text, and also the implications or how they ultimately explain or give context to China's vague acknowledgement and denial of sanctions use. Okay, So this is the main chunk of my discussion of findings. So for the first pair of identities representing positionalities, again, this refers to locating agency for the two relevant subjects. Starting with the frequency or count, around 36% of all extracted predicates fall under this category, making it the second most common pair of particular oppositions among the three. More specifically, China's victim representation of itself is mostly anchored on stressing an innocent or a passive position, with this descriptor ranking first above benevolent and justified victim representations. And in terms of how this descriptor is manifested in the texts, we have here some examples. China would emphasize that its claims are simply rational, legitimate, or owing to how they are, simply put, justified entitlements of China that they must naturally claim and protect. Its position is argued to be consistent with rational logic, and this logical position was simply harmed by the other's active and wrongful actions. And moving to how the other side in relation to this is portrayed, around 29% of the predicates attached to the other falls under this abstracted category. Simply put, these predications describe that China that the other has committed specific violations to China. So it basically predicates what those violations are, pinning the wrongful behavior to the offender other. As for the implications on how this pairing helped China obfuscate its sanctions use, portraying China in a hierarchy of dominance where it is the passive innocent victim provides necessary context that could indirectly justify coercion. And related to being perceived positively despite recourse to coercion, such a self-description emphasizes its benign nature while also magnifying the other's fault. And with China's innocence or claimed innocence grounded on claiming that it was simply enjoying its justified entitlements at the time the crime happened, reactive sanctions could justify for itself even without direct acknowledgement. Such, in China's point of view, is how justice should be upheld at the international level. So that's for positionalities. Moving to the second pair, again, this one refers to the descriptors that associate deeper motivations to the relevant actors. The assumption here is that behind their specific actions are deeper intentions that reflect their true nature as being benevolent or peaceful or malevolent or malicious. Around 23% of all the predicates fall under this category, making it the least or the third among the three abstracted pairings. It is natural to find this set appearing last because China does not really spend much time in elaborating what the motivations are of the relevant actors. For China's benevolent or peaceful description of itself, this category represents around 29% of all self-predicates. So this means that next to portraying itself as being an innocent victim, China also sees itself as being fair and peaceful, guided by genuinely good intentions. As for specific manifestations within text, China often describes itself as the one party or the only party who prioritizes the sound development of bilateral relations. And now it is all about peacefully solving the dispute through dialogue and negotiation. Ultimately, the message of the benevolent victim self that China tries to promote is this. Despite being the victim of the other's wrongdoing and ill intentions, China still has nothing but pure intentions, trying to work with the other to seek peaceful resolutions to the conflict. And this is where China's related description of the other comes in. While the counterpart description of being malevolent comes in last, this category adds another layer of negative interpretation to the other's wrong actions. More specifically, being a malevolent offender means that their actions represent nothing short of malicious or ill motivations that compromises China's interests. So China would say that the other is purely motivated by geopolitical zero-sum calculations. as far as how this pair of descriptors contribute to victimhood discourse at work, this dualism effectively establishes a contrast between peace and malice, showing that China is the good guy in this normative battle. And similar to the previous pair, it contextualizes China's indirect justification of its sanctions use. China doesn't need to admit or say that it will use sanctions to punish or get back at the Philippines. Creating a story where China is the peaceful party and the other is the malevolent one does the job of justifying the presence of coercion. And related to that, the bad publicity fallback from the use of sanctions could be sanitized by a frequent recourse to this kind of storytelling, where China is basically the peaceful, benevolent victim. Now, moving to the last pair of particular oppositions, these describe what the two parties must be doing based on how events have transpired. Of course, this is based on China's understanding. And for its frequency and count, this pair consists the most number of predicates among the three dualisms, with the guilty offender representation of the other ranking first for the group, and the justified victim description for the self ranking last. China is simply fond of telling its counterpart what it should do. So China would say that Japan or South Korea has the full responsibility for the dispute in question and must listen to the voice of the Chinese people, or that it is up to the Philippines or Mongolia to take measures that will bring back bilateral relations to the right track. So effectively, when it comes to the presence of sanctions, China is basically putting the responsibility for this to the other. Because the other is guilty, then it is the other's responsibility to make situations normal again. Emphasizing the other's guilt highlights their agency for the presence of any adverse impact, which includes sanctions. As for the list occurring description of the self, this is understandably so because the justified victim identification simply tells us what China is ready to adopt, that China is ready to adopt countermeasures against the other, without elaborating on what kind. And interestingly, such threat to retaliate was only found in disputes involving relatively strong powers such as South Korea and Japan. And in the former, the United States is partially involved. But when it comes to smaller powers, the Philippines, Norway, and Mongolia, China does not openly threaten broad coercion, but it only articulates that it has the resolve and will to protect its interests. So, this particular description of the self implies that China does want to make it known that it has the capability to retaliate, broadly defined. But having this predication as the least occurring of all three also says that the primary discursive recourse and emphasis is still restraint and ultimately portraying itself as being an innocent and peaceful victim. So China is able to signal coercion without saying that it is in the form of sanctions, while still being focused on portraying itself as the real victim in the issue. So overall, this last pair provides added ammunition, if you will, for China to justify recourse to sanctions without admitting to it, emphasizing instead that the other is guilty for placing bilateral relations at such a sorry state, and by arguing that it is justified in retaliating or expressing its resolve should it see fit. Now, summarizing everything that I have just said, we have to revisit the main point of curiosity for this research, which was to make sense of the inconsistency between its behavior and rhetoric when it comes to unilateral sanctions. Focusing specifically on rhetoric, we took the assumption that the answer can be uncovered by specifically or seriously focusing on discourse. And so this paper asks these two questions. What kind of discourse has China adopted, and why has it stuck with this discourse? As shown by the extensive analysis presented here, what this paper found is that underneath China's consistent obfuscation lies China's recourse to a discourse of victimhood, which it employs to maintain a positive representation of itself amid the dispute and to indirectly justify the use of sanctions without having to say it used them. And in terms of how this discourse has been reflected in the 279 documents analyzed, it was found that across all 6 cases, China has consistently presented a core opposition between victim and offender. More specifically, making up these core oppositions are more particular oppositions that identifies China as being in a passive position, having peaceful intentions, and having the resolve and will to respond against the other. And indirectly related to this, it described the other as being the wrongful, active actor, as being malevolent because its intentions are ill, and being the fully responsible or guilty party tasked to fix the falling out. And as you can see, these interpretations can be traced back to the main framework for this research, which is victimhood. And victimhood, as I have argued before, is basically pursued to establish one's innocence, to justify coercion or revenge, and to uphold positive recognition. So, by consistently promoting itself as a victim in similar conflict situations, China is essentially hoping to get the best of both worlds, maintaining its positive image as a non wielder of sanctions while being able to indirectly justify using them when it needs to. By way of conclusion, I offer several insights highlighting implications for future research that this paper might have offered. First, this paper's serious focus on official government discourses as reflected in MOFA documents sought to look deeper on China's prevailing biases or mental structures that inevitably shapes its perceptions of the world. And in foreign policy analysis, looking at official discourses, I would argue, could be one way for researchers to dig deeper into a country's foreign policy logic. Second, the paper is also an attempt to contribute to the sanctions literature by taking attitudes as a serious research focus. In this way, I recognize the importance of constructing different meanings or understanding toward the practice of using sanctions itself, which have yet to be adequately addressed in the literature. And third, the entire premise of this paper is that China's sanctions attitude is unique. And given its unique take on how to appreciate and implement sanctions, combined with its existing power status as a frequent user of economic statecraft, China may be poised to challenge the way we traditionally employ and understand economic statecraft. And lastly, my attempt to employ victimhood as framework is an attempt to also contribute to the growing literature on this end. And the current state or case on unilateral sanctions can be expanded to include China's involvement in the use of multilateral sanctions. As I have argued in my thesis, there's also a huge disparity there in terms of China's behavior vis-a-vis traditional Western major powers. Scholars can also look at the experience of other states where victimhood can be used as framework. And the case of India has been used, and Russia as well, to make sense of foreign policy logics of post-colonial states and other rising powers. So that's it. And if you have questions, I'm more than open to take them and reply to them. Thank you so much for your time.
Many thanks, Assistant Professor Gloria, for that insightful and very detailed presentation of your paper. Indeed, your paper tells us how the politics of language figure in China's relationship with other states, and of course, their implications and the ways it justifies state behavior. And I'm sure a lot of uh, people who have listened to your presentation have comments or questions. So kindly raise your hands virtually if you have questions. I think there are already some on the chat box. From Professor Francis Domingo. Well done on your tenure lecture, Miko. I have one question and one comment. Apologies for not speaking up. I'm currently driving, o, diba? A question. How do you conceptualize unilateral economic sanctions as an expression of state power? Is it hard power or soft power?
Mhm. Uh, well, yeah, the way I conceptualized unilateral sanctions, I think mostly refers to it being a hard power. I guess this is so because it has to do with how China understands or appreciate the use of sanctions to begin with, and from China's experience, having been at the receiving end of Western sanctions, at least this is the official articulation or argument of China. We are against sanctions use because it impedes the economic growth of a particular state. It directly interferes with the internal affairs of a state. Therefore, we are totally against the practice. So, based on that understanding, you can argue that China appreciates sanctions as a hard power form of statecraft, which is also, I guess, the type of understanding that I have adopted for this research. And also, thank you for your comments on implausible deniability here. I agree that this could be a useful concept in trying to explain unilateral sanctions used for China. So, thank you for the comments, Sir Francis, and be safe driving.
Okay. Anyone else? Oo. Yeah, I have one question for you, Miko, while waiting for the others. What is the value of using this methodology? No, because um, we've often read about China, for instance, in for people who normally do not read, for instance, journal articles. How does this methodology, uh, challenge our views about China? Something that we've probably not seen before, no? From conventional accounts of China. So my question is, especially for undergraduate students, um, I think you've already mentioned this earlier, but then just to sort of further elaborate on it, what is the value of using this methodology in analyzing, for instance, state actions?
Yes, thank you for that question on the methods, Ma'am Jean.
Mm.
I think the value, as far as I have understood it, is really focusing on beyond, if you will, the how China has actually flexed its power on the ground, and focusing on how it actually articulates what it perceives to be an image of itself. And by focusing on how it has constructed its identity through language and through discourse, we get to appreciate, another dimension of Chinese power, if you will, which I would argue is not really often highlighted in our discussions, especially in the Philippines, of how China is becoming this, very formidable power that we must, direct our foreign policy to. So I guess that's also one of the research agenda that I really want to focus on: China's power positioning, if you will, and how it uses language to do that. No? So yeah, I guess that would be the contribution, if you will, of using this methodology to the entire understanding of China's rise and China's power.
Okay, we have four other questions. May we hear from Assistant Professor Go?
Hmm. And si Sir Aris then, or si
Yeah,
Sir
yeah.
Go muna. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Miko, for the very wonderful presentation. It's very, very clear. But of course, the main source of the discourse is the official statement. I was
Mhm.
wondering, pushing it further, probably. Maybe it's already out of the research that you have done, but pushing it further. Because I was thinking how the internally, domestically, Chinese nationalism would eventually be feeding into this official statement. For example, the more recent case I can remember is the H&M case. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. And their statement about the use of Xinjiang cotton, no, and
Mhm.
how and at first there was no official position from MOFA, no? But then the people on their own were burning H&M materials. Online, we're already talking about this boycott of these products, no, which I would assume would have the same uh, for example, when you were talking about the Philippine bananas, and they're very conscious of where products are coming from, and if there are issues involving the countries, they would rather not support this. So how maybe in the future, how do you think will this figure into the research direction you're heading to?
All right. Yeah. Uh, Thank you so much for that, Rob, for the question on, I guess, domestic discourses and how it could inform my research. Actually, prior to this paper being published, the intention was really to sort of establish interdiscursivity. So I was also including discourses found in the media, as well as discourses articulated domestically. But for the purpose of simplicity, I just focused on official discourses. But definitely, it figures into this whole narrative of China being the victim in these conflicts to begin with, and therefore justifying the use of coercion. You can even say that in some instances, there are evidences that the Chinese government was actually fanning the flames, if you will, and creating the necessary domestic context, if you will, to further justify its reaction to, say, the Philippines or South Korea. So you can say that the government is still involved in curating that discourse, but currently I'm not confident to make any inferences on how domestic discourses figure if they are genuinely against, for instance, the Philippines or such. But yeah, that could definitely figure in the future direction of this research. Thank you
Thanks,
for that.
Nico. I'll let the two three persons ask their questions. I'll first, and then you may just respond later. No, I'll first read Professor Aris Arugay's question. Congrats on the lecture, Miko. I found it interesting that China's uses its victimhood as a frame of its foreign policy discourse. What are the likely historical and political sources of this self-perception? Is it part of its century of humiliation or its stratagem of downplaying itself against its opponents? And finally, until when do you think can China play the victim card? So this is Professor Aris Arugay's question. May we hear from Associate Professor Tagibao?
Yes, good morning. First of all, thank you, Miko, for a very insightful and informative lecture and presentation. I have a few questions here, but I'll just limit it to one. Later on, probably I'll ask again. My first question is actually methodological. I saw that in your analysis, you showed binary oppositions, or basically core oppositions. Was this victim offender binary opposition analysis predefined? Meaning, was it something that you were searching for already in the text? Or on the other hand, what did this emerge actually from the text in the process of your coding and your categorical analysis? I ask this question because I would like to find out about and also show and probably underscore the distinction in the logic of inquiry. Are you, in your research, in your presentation, actually developing and building a concept? Or on the other hand, if it was predefined, are you actually testing and revising already a pre-existing concept in these categories? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Associate Professor Tagibao. Tagibao, may I call as Professor Kraft? Professor Kraft, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jean. And Nico, congratulations. That was a really insightful lecture. There are just a few things that I'd like to ask at this point in time. One is conceptually speaking, right? When you talked about the idea of unilateral sanctions, for instance, you defined it in terms of the actions of the government, right? And yet, if you look at your the example of cases that you have there, there is that reference to Japan in 2012 with regards to, of course, the case of the Diaoyu and Senkaku Islands dispute, where your indication of or the activity that was actually conducted by China referred to protests and boycotts, right? So the question there is, how do you explain, because I presume that protests and boycotts involves public activities, right? Or at least actions by the public as opposed to actions by the government. So how does that fit into the kind of definition that you're making regarding what unilateral economic sanctions are? So that's one. And the second one, and I think this is also something that Assistant Professor Tana is asking, but let me just take a first crack at it, then she can pursue it a little bit later. Now, is the question of audience, right? Discourses clearly are directed in their effects on a particular audience. I think what you were saying in your lecture is that when you talk about this discourse of victimhood, you were limiting yourself to a certain extent to the idea that the imagination that you're trying to influence, so to speak, is the international public, right? Not the local Chinese people's perceptions. Now, although to a certain extent this goes back to something that Associate Professor Tagiba was actually asking, as well as I think what Assistant Professor Tana is asking as well. But in this context, that you're talking about, that we're in, the focus is on the impact of this kind of public, this notion of public diplomacy, targeting the way that China is perceived internationally, right? I'm just curious to the extent to which, how do they account for clear asymmetries in power, right, in the position that they actually have in relation to those that they are actually describing as the malevolent actors in this particular case. So in other words, what's interesting here is that the rhetoric, the discourse, seems to be something that has to be justified as well, in terms of clear asymmetries of power that exists between China and the other, right? Or at least those that they're actually pointing to as the other. Is this something that is not important as far as the discourse is actually concerned? Or is this something that somehow is accounted for within the kind of discourse and within the kinds of binaries that you were actually talking about earlier on? Thank you.
Okay. Assistant Professor Gloria, kindly respond to the three questions, please.
All right. Thank you so much for all those questions. Starting with Professor Aris Arugay, definitely, I think there is a sort of historical and political source, if you will, for this self-perception. And I was actually able to elaborate more on that in my article, where there are a lot of scholars already arguing that this victimhood position comes from China's reading of its international position since 1949 or even before, and that it has come to sort of internalize that type of identity. So there's this one very, I guess, influential book when I was doing the research on victimhood. It's by Chatterjee Miller, Wronged by Empire. So the argument there is that post-colonial states such as India and China tend to assume a strategic position of victimhood whenever they find themselves in conflict. And this is because it, stems from, as you have indicated in this question, a century of humiliation, for instance, for China. So it seems like China is always, at it, trying to tell its story that it has been humiliated indirectly by positioning itself as always the powerless victim, if you will. But as Professor Kraft has mentioned, there are some asymmetries there. In terms of when will China continue playing the victim card? I would argue, and this is already based on my conversations with scholars in China, China would continue playing the victim card until it serves its purpose of, uh, I guess, for a lack of a better term, whitewashing or uh, positioning itself as this moral power or peaceful major power. And in my thesis, the argument there was really China does this victim identity to be positively perceived. No? And when we talk about positive perception, it has to do with how China understood the image and identity of traditional Western major powers. So China wants to be distinctively positive, so distinct and positive vis-a-vis those Western powers. So if the Western powers have traditionally done sanctions use, then it is a strict position for China not to endorse the use of sanctions because that's how it would set itself apart. And uh, admittedly, this position of victimhood is something that is also very unique to China in relation to its major power peers. So, in relation to the last question of Professor Arugay, I think this type of trope that China would continues to assume for itself will keep on playing in the narratives or in the discourses, if you will, as long as it is able to distinctively position itself among its major power peers. And you can see that already, and this is already a hypothesis, with how China has responded to accusations that the coronavirus actually started from within its borders. So when I was reading the responses of MOFA, there was this trope of victimhood again, that they are being attacked maliciously by Western powers, and instead of focusing on the international good. Thank you for that question, Professor Arugay. I hope I was able to elaborate on your questions. For the methodological question raised by Professor Tagibaw, I guess the answer would be like this. No? So I have been reading the MOFA documents since 2018. And prior to reading, and when reading those documents, I still didn't have a theory for my thesis. So I was reading it, and at least based on my understanding, without much knowledge of theory at that time, what I was really able to uncover was that China wants to be positively perceived in these particular disputes. And then as I was reading them continuously, I was trying to find out how to make sense of that positive imaging. And then this idea that what if China is doing this uh, positive imaging pursuit through this idea that it is the victim in the dispute, which was already very obvious when you read the documents. So admittedly, I looked for a theory that basically said that victimhood is something that China continuously subscribed to. So yes, you can say that it was predefined because I searched for that theory and I wanted to apply if that theory could work in what I was understanding prior to, finding the theory. Because before I wrote the paper, the framework was really social identity theory. And that is what I have explained in relation to Professor Arugay's question, that China wants to be distinctively perceived vis-a-vis Western major powers. And I sort of wanted to be more specific about that. Hence, I looked for a theory that sort of captures what I was able to observe within the documents. Hence, you have the victim offender descriptions. So, in a way, it was predefined, at least for the victimhood part. But um, I guess for what it stands for, I was already able to read and I guess uncover them from the documents upon continuous reading of the text that I have called. Now for Professor Kraft's question, so let me just recall the question of Professor Kraft. Oh, oh yeah, I think Professor Kraft has two questions. First was on the public nature of the sanctions. yeah, that is a tricky part, not just for Japan actually, but also for South Korea, because there's a public opinion sanctions type of move related there too. But I argue that it is actually supported by the Chinese government, which sort of transcends to the government or public sphere. So, and at the same time, I make the argument that China could have prevented, public opinion from going to a level of, I guess, so much vigilance and so much aggressiveness towards Chinese economic establishments Japanese or South Korean economic establishments in China. So to answer that question, I still argue that it is public. It is within the public sphere, precisely because there are evidences that the Chinese government has been involved in invoking the public power, if you will. And to your question of the asymmetries in power, uh, you can say that it is not relevant as far as the paper was concerned, but definitely it can be unpacked as to how power structures figure into my study on discourse. But that's precisely the point. The fact that there is obviously observable power asymmetries between China and the Philippines, the more that China needs to double down on this type of discourse where it is basically the victim and it must do what it can to protect its interests. So, yeah, I guess at least that's my hypothesis at this point. No? But as I have said in my framework, asserting victimhood itself is also a manifestation of power. For you to be able to construct this type of belief or discourse of yourself, you must be able to have listeners to begin with, and that involves attracting, and attracting means power as far as victimhood is concerned. So yeah, I hope I was able to answer those three questions. Thank you.
Yes, Miko. I think Associate Professor Zialcita is going to take over as moderator at this point in time.
We have two more questions here. One comes on. What happened? Okay. We have a question from Professor Teitana. It's written down. I can't find it. Here it is.
Yeah.
Okay. Well done, Miko. Very interesting presentation. A few questions. How successful or effective is this strategy of victim playing? How is China's construction as a received by outside observers or the others, or China's trading partners like Japan and South Korea? To whom is it trying to justify its actions? Really? Who are the target audience? Okay? The domestic public or external actors? Those referred to as the others. So that's Tay's question. And I want to call on Jaime, Professor Jaime Naval, to ask his question. Hello, Jaime. There you go.
Thank you, Professor Zialcita. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Miko, for this lecture. Wisdom is not arrogated by those who are much older than you. I think your presentation is very instructive and forceful. It makes me think more about how I view the Chinese, particularly on the decision making. One of the most dominant theories or orientation in trying to analyze Chinese decision making, including foreign policy, is the concept of the face. When you use your face, and related to what Professor Arugay earlier inquired on the concept of humiliation, this victimhood to me, as I'm trying to reflect on it, seems to be an alternative, if not although related, maybe more powerful theory to explain, because face is largely cultural to me or anthropological, but the notion of victimhood is both cognitive and affective. It anchors itself on history, on perception and intentions. At the same time, uniquely and probably ingeniously, if they're doing it deliberately, on the moral discourse in the psychological or the psyche. So congratulations for pointing out even psychological references on the victimhood. But my question would be, in your own opinion, having dug deep into this on the literature and on this material, victimhood would have its pluses and minuses, its advantages and disadvantages. So maybe just to make it brief, in your opinion, what would be the pluses of victimhood as a strategy by a major or a great power, and what would be the handicaps? Because definitely not everything would be working perfectly. And just a last point for the moment, different Chinese leaders, even before Xi Jinping, had intimated or explicitly said that when the time comes when China becomes a power to reckon with, it will not be a power like the powers that we've had. So in your opinion, is it really behaving in practice like a different power, or simply inventing or justifying its practice similar to the rest, except they use a different concept or they point to a different strategy? But so essentially, that's my comment and the question for now. Thank you.
Can I call on one more to ask a question? See
Yes, sir.
if
Sure,
Mr.
sir.
Enrico has a question. Para tatlo. There you go. Professor Ruth, Mr.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I didn't hear it. Okay. First of all, thank you very much, Miko, and congratulations for presenting a very organized, well-prepared, informative, and thought-provoking, I guess, to those who are interested in China and those who are interested in methodology. No? So I'm very happy that there are many questions that are being raised and they seem to challenge you to address them. But anyway, I don't really have a question, but I'd like to go back to what was asked earlier on, with regard to the binary opposition, whether it is, the way I understood the question was that whether it was something that was assumed or is it a finding, no? But I'm going to make this comment for the benefit of the students who are in the audience right now, because I suppose that this has not been clarified, although Miko, although Assistant Professor Gloria, of course, I'm very glad explained it, no? That it is very important that when we do research, even if we're going through documents, that we are coming from somewhere. So, and that's precisely why we do the review of related literature. So to come up with, I think it was evident that in the analysis that there was some assumptions that were made at the very beginning, and that in other words, may hugot, no, may pinanggalingan yung ginawang analysis. So I suppose that my opinion there is that it couldn't be just a finding. Because if you're going to be like that, baka hindi ka matapos dun sa research mo. I mean, basa ng documents, no? And of course, I noted the huge amount of documents that Assistant Professor Gloria went through, no? And the demonstration of the method that was employed in the thesis, I think is very good, no? It shows the kind of scholarship that was practiced, no, in coming up with a study. So congratulations for that. And as I said, it's just a note, a comment for the benefit of the students here in this group. So thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, you can answer the questions now from Dr. Tana, from Jaime, Professor Naval. Go.
Okay. Thank you for the questions. Starting first with Assistant Professor Tana's question on whether this was positively received by, I guess, the target countries. uh, yeah, or outside observers. So this is actually like a question that I was sort of waiting for. So yeah, it's not positively perceived by others, and oftentimes it was very confusing. For instance, in the Philippines, there was this one interview by former President Aquino, where he admitted that we really don't know what to do with with Scarborough Shoal standoff because China seems to be sending mixed signals. So in terms of that particular question, which we can explore in another paper, I think it's failing as a strategy because China is not being perceived positively by hiding its true intentions. Actually, you can argue that receiving countries or target countries actually continues to, I guess, add onto their mistrust of China because of this type of strategy. So the argument that could be made here is that, and this is already going to, policy suggestions for China, it actually plays in China's objective to admit to the use of sanctions so that you can have clear expectations. And at the same time, it helps to establish a more trustworthy, I guess, image for China, if you will, which goes well with the positive imaging goal of China as a major power. But then again, the question there would be, will China even do that? And I don't think so because China really is bent on having this legendary opposition preserved no matter what happens. So yeah, it's not really panning out well, I would argue, because the interpretations are really that China is becoming more assertive. By using tacit sanctions, China is becoming more tricky as a major power. And this goes to the next question here, which is, who is the target? Well, the audience that I'm really talking about is really those who would contribute to a positive perception of China, and that is the external audience. So more than the parties to the dispute, China is really trying to convince those that are watching, if you will, that China is the victim here, just like it was in throughout all of its history. So China is trying to sell that story, and um, whether it is working or not, again, is another question that we can explore in another paper. And that is also quite related, I would say, to Professor Naval's questions, the pluses and minuses, or the advantages or disadvantages of assuming this type of position. Yes, I argue that this is sort of a more nuanced take, if you will, on the usual understanding that China wants to save face. And in that sense, there are advantages and disadvantages, you can argue. For the advantages, well, on top of my head right now, it sort of puts a spotlight on China's historical experiences, on basically China's belief that it has been a victim of many injustices throughout history, and these contemporary disputes just add to that, historical trauma. And for more on the advantages, you can go back to the objectives of trying to assume this victimhood position to begin with. And I think, at least from their perspective, the main advantage is to stick with its legendary opposition to sanctions without having to bar itself from the practice itself. So you can say that that is an advantage. But of course, as I have replied to Assistant Professor Tana's question, the disadvantage clearly is the growing mistrust that target countries would have towards China. So I guess you can argue that it's just a matter of time before China openly acknowledges the use of sanctions. But as I have communicated with other professors in China, they say that it's not going to happen in the likely future because it's a really one of the core positions of Chinese foreign policy, which is to be consistent with its opposition against interference. So, um, is it behaving differently compared to other major powers? Well, this is really the, I guess, main point of curiosity that I want to explore in my future papers, probably in my dissertation as well. Um, really there's this push, to try to understand where China is coming from and how it could affect its pursuit for a major power position or status. I would argue that there are some semblances that it is behaving differently from other Western major powers. Um, but it remains to be seen whether those, I guess, articulations, no, because at this point I only see them being articulated, but the realities on the ground could be argued that it's the same type of behavior that other Western major powers have been doing. But I guess what I'm trying to say here is that you cannot really disassociate discourse from actions on the ground. The mere fact that China is trying to articulate that it is trying to be a different major power and that it is going to be a different one speaks volumes, I would argue, into what kind of major power it would be. You know. So, and for the last comments of Professor Ruth Lusterio Rico, thank you so much, ma'am, for clarifying the methodological context of, I guess, where this research is coming from. And those are taken noted of. And I guess, sir, we have more questions.
Yes, I will read the one from Aaron Pagliari. It's on the chat.
Okay.
But
Okay.
later, Jal has a question. But first, okay, congrats, Miko, on your question. I wish to dovetail with Professor Kraft's and Professor Tana's questions. Since we can say that China could be considered already as an institution builder, for example, the AIIB, China seems to really be pursuing greater global governance proactivity. Do you think, moving forward, the victimhood discourse will eventually lend itself untenable with China's continued occupation of significant leadership positions in various global governance architecture? And then, okay, let's hear from Jal, your question.
Thank you, JP. So I'll try to merge the questions that I have para lang so that it's a brief. Given your analysis, you've analyzed basically victimhood and you broke it into smaller parts. And I like the particular slide where you presented the matrix of self and others. My question is, shouldn't this even warrant a corresponding reconceptualization of what coercion is? Because it seems that it's supposed to be expected. You qualified something, victimhood. You started off with an assumption of what economic coercion looks like and unilateral sanctions. Are there variations, qualitative variations as well? When particular, say for instance, position or intention would have certain configurations, would there be corresponding configurations also on the other end? It may be a question, it's also slightly something that I'm suggesting that you might pursue for future research. And then the last one that I have on my notes is that has China's view of the other change in your study, particularly focusing less on agency and more on conditions or structures? I know that the tendency is that if there is a self and the other, it's really actor-oriented. Plus, this is also a limitation of a binary opposition logic. But being constructivist is not just to construct agency or actors. It's also to be able to construct what a scenario is, for instance. Do you have you encountered some of these features in your research? Thank you.
Okay, you can have answers, Professor Gloria.
All right. Thank you for the questions, Prof. Jal, and also to Aaron. As to Aaron's question, yes, I would consider that China is becoming an institution builder, especially in the area of international economics and economic governance. So with greater proactivity in global governance, as you have mentioned here, yes, you can argue that it would be less believable, if that's what you mean, for China to consistently assume the victim position. But it doesn't mean that it would stop using it. because I guess it still serves that same purpose of uh, trying to positively portray China, right? So, and as you can see with the victimhood framework, perhaps what you would be able to observe are differences in configuration as to how victimhood is being asserted. So you might have like the benevolent aspect of victimhood as the one being asserted more rather than say the innocent or the um uh I guess the justified victim type of positioning. So you could see variations in that, but as long as it serves the purpose of being able to positively represent itself, then it would still play a role in its foreign policy articulation. And it's a configuration really of the us versus them type of, I guess, strategy, discursive strategy that China and other similar powers could be adopting to justify their position. And in response to Associate Professor Tagibao's question, um, yes, this is actually the direction that I was actually thinking of going to in terms of how China understands the idea of coercion, or at this point, understands the idea of sanctions. Because there are indications here, as far as the study is concerned, that sanctions is being qualified, not just, as I have argued in my RRL, taken for granted by Western powers, that it is a legitimate foreign policy tool. But as far as China is concerned, there are types of sanctions which are allowed and not allowed, or justified and not justified. So in China's case, it is basically indirectly saying that if it harms core interests, and core interests there are defined in China's foreign policy principles, no, then it doesn't count as coercion. Rather, it is a sudden react well, not sudden reaction, but a consequence of the other's wrongdoing. So coercion here refers to how sanctions are traditionally being employed by Western powers, and that is usually to foster regime change. No? So when you use sanctions with that particular intention, then it's basically equivalent to coercion. So yes, I would argue that there are implications here as to how, at least from China's point of view, coercion is being understood, right? So, and to the other questions, has China's view of the other changed, moving towards a more, I guess, structural appreciation of the matter? To be honest, I haven't really explored that, but thinking about your question, there are some manifestations that it could be really structural in a way that China sees itself within the international system and how it could behave moving forward. Hence, that could sort of explains the continuity of asserting this discursive strategy of victimhood. So, yes, preliminarily, I would say that there are indications to that effect, but it remains to be, I guess, empirically backed by if such a hypothesis could work, no, and could be also another subject of a future research. Thank you for those questions. Do we have more, sir?
Okay, I don't see any more questions. Can anyone think of more questions? Oh, can I just give my own impression of this China strategy?
Yes, go ahead, sir. More than welcome, sir.
The strategy that the ostrich tries to use when it confronts danger, it just hides its head in the sand, but its body is like so obvious.
Yeah.
I don't know, this strategy, it's trying to hide behind this victimhood image, when in fact it many times when it uses these sanctions, even if they don't define them as sanctions, they look like they're acting like bullies actually. Is that a valid like appreciation of
Yeah. This is quite related to what Assistant Professor Tano was saying, that it's not actually working on its benefit, because target countries are actually perceiving China to be more of a bully because of this, I guess, dishonesty and hypocrisy on its end. So you're definitely right that it's, it's preposterous in that sense. So
Okay, the term hypocrisy, that's the word. No?
yeah, yeah.
Okay, I think there's one more raised hand here. Si Jaime. Professor Navarro?
Thank you, John Paul. Your last word actually triggered this comment and question of mine when you talk about hypocrisy. Major powers with different ages would always justify whatever colonial, invasive, or expansionist intents it has. Just to cite, for example, the US has a number: manifest destiny, benevolent assimilation. China in the old, it's what was the term? It's having this approval from the mandate of heaven, to that effect. But this concept of victimhood is double-edged. It has its negative and positive connotation. In fact, inside question for Miko is that you said it's a positive representation. Is that your term, or you capture it from one of the literature, or even China's justification? It's victimhood as a positive representation, because victimhood at first blush is a negative projection of oneself. Second, to successfully project yourself, if this would be the affirmative, as a victim, you have to be portrayed as the weaker power or the weaker entity. When China implements, for example, its coercive measures against, for example, the Philippines or Taiwan or South Korea, we don't mention Japan because it's not on the same level, on the same species. But you will have to, as you know, you have to work double time in order to convince the public, hey, I'm a big guy, I'm being bullied. Kawawa ka naman, tatawanan ka lang. Kasi you have to prove that you're the big guy and you're the one aggrieved. So it works in counteractive to what you intend to project. So while victimhood, the other justifications for such colonial, expansive, or predatory policies would be phrased in a positive light, like manifest destiny, Monroe Doctrine. China is projecting itself as aggrieved and therefore reactive. We do this kasi we resort to this in view of. So you always have to justify your action based on something that was a travesty that was committed. So in the process, you're trying to calibrate between fair vindication as against simple retaliation, if not vindictiveness. And that's where the hypocrisy lies, because you would have to persuade the rest that the labeling you attach to your justification is fair and honest. And second, that the actions that you're resorting to is also calibrated, commensurate to the humiliation or to the breach that was extended to you. So as a concept, I identified with Professor Tana, it would be counterproductive. So now the world will have to say, China has to justify first why it is a victim. Whereas in the first is pwede namang diretso, no, in view of our national interests, etc. Or outright when you talk about in view of our core interests, rather than say because we're doing activity. Parang hirap i-convince ng public, individuals and states that it's a victim given given the circumstances. So that's just my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir JP. Are there any more questions, or should I respond to that?
You wanna comment on the comment?
Very quick lang, sir. Yes, definitely. there's this in the literature, yes, positive representation has been used, to frame victimhood as sort of a social identity strategy, and also social identity theory has used positive representation. To your point on asserting victimhood, yes, it will remain a challenge for China, who is materially powerful, to assert victimhood. And this is what Niels Christie, someone who's wrote a lot on victimhood, asserts that there are certain qualities that you need to pass, if you will, to be referred to as an ideal victim. So the ideal victim is an old lady who is traveling alone in a forest, something to that effect. And China, of course, hits some of these qualities, but not all, which makes it hard for it to justify its victimhood. But nevertheless, I guess the idea here that victimhood is really more of a strategy from China's perspective, and it is being employed discursively. So, and there's no, I guess, there's no one actor, if you will, who has a monopoly of being the victim. As I've said, it also takes power, if you will, to argue for victimhood. So yeah, I agree with the implications of your comments that it would be laborious for China to consistently argue for victimhood. Yeah, credible victim legitimation from audience. Yes, legitimacy is also one characteristic that was identified in the literature to be considered, viable for this status to begin with. Mhm. That's it for me, Sir JP.
All right. So let me see. I don't think there are any more questions. Pahabol, one last call for questions, either in the chat box or raise your hand. I can't see all of you. Well, it seems people are now satisfied. Congratulations, now, Miko.
Thank you po to everyone. Thank you for attending and spending your time to listen to my lecture.
Yeah, very. The term that was recurring was insightful. Okay, for me, yeah, I'm sure many people. I mean, the people who listen to you learned a lot about China, about discourse analysis, and how to go about using it. Thank you very much, Miko. Well, can I request the people from the department, the faculty, to stay for some